Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the very hot Wood of the Holly here in SoCal. And as part of my larger project of getting my PhD in everything, I have an extremely special guest. He was born and raised in Israel to Zionist parents of the founding generation. He is a historian at Brown University. He's written extensively about war, genocide, Nazism, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. He's best known for his studies of the German army during World War II, and he served in the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, for 4 years, a term that included the 1973 Yom Kippur War, postings in the West Bank, Northern Sinai, and Gaza. And he ended his service as an infantry company commander, which gives him a unique authority to talk about today's subjects. More recently, he has written extensively about the catastrophe in Gaza in the New York Times. And he has written a terrific new book, which I read and recommend. It's called Israel, What Went Wrong? I am super pleased to have him with me today. Welcome, shalom, salam merci, Omer Bartov. How are you?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm well, thanks.
Oh, good. Well, it's more than my pleasure. I just want to start this off with a thought I just sort of mentioned to you. I grew up, unlike yourself, on a kibbutz in the outer reaches of Israel in the very comfortable upper middle class suburban confines of, you might even describe it as another Jewish ghetto in the San Fernando Valley. From New York. And there's, as I said earlier, pretty much every female relative I have, mothers, aunts, grandmothers on both sides, had a luncheon in their honor given by some Israeli charity, whether it was Hadassah or Ort or the Jewish Federation, or more recently, Stand With Us. I think I received a forest worth of trees in my name at my bar mitzvah. I was raised to worship and admire that gutty little underdog over there in the Middle East, this little postage stamp of territory surrounded by millions of supposedly adversarial Arabs. But in the last few years, and after having read your book, which I really recommended, conversations with some other important thinkers, I'm coming to a very different and rather harsher conclusion about that light unto the nations, otherwise known as Israel. And just your thoughts about that as a way to start this off so I can shut up.
Yeah, thanks. So that's really what I tried to write a book about, right? What went wrong in that place. Now, I should say that, because I chose that title, there are some people who have told me, what do you mean, what went wrong? The whole thing was wrong from the very beginning. So the very assumption that something went wrong means that something was right.
Right.
And yes, and I think that's true. That criticism comes more from the left or from people who support Palestinians, and I can understand the logic of it, but I don't share it. And there are other people who have said to me, some who are colleagues of mine and who are scholars of the Holocaust and very supportive of Israel, that the only thing that went wrong is me, and that I should not have written that book. So, yes, I do think that something went wrong, which doesn't mean that there were not signs of that or that there was not a potential of things going wrong. And I can explain what I mean by that from the very beginning.
Right.
But I don't think that, and I don't believe as a historian, that history is predetermined, that everything that happened, say, in 2023 and subsequently was predetermined the moment that Theodor Herzl, the sort of visionary of Zionism thought that it might be a good idea to have a Jewish state. I don't think that's the way we can understand history.
Mhm.
And so in the book, I try to trace what is the moment when things shifted in a direction that didn't make the subsequent course of events inevitable, but much more likely. Um, and that's really where, so halfway through the book, I start talking about that moment, which is really the moment of the foundation of the state.
Right. Well, I think it's important for fair-minded people to be able to hold two sort of thoughts in their head at one time. By that, for me, what was a complete miracle for the Jews in Palestine and then Israel was at the same time a catastrophe and a tragedy for the co-inhabitants living right by their side in relatively equal numbers, that of course being the Palestinians. And just to pick up on what you just said, it seems to me that the pivotal moment, or one of the pivotal moments, of which there are many, was the failure to follow up this rather liberal declaration of independence with a constitution or a founding covenant that would solidify that into law. As of this moment, as you say, it is yet to happen.
So, yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that in 1947, on the 29th of November, when the United Nations, newly founded, issues a partition resolution, Resolution 181, to partition mandatory Palestine, what is referred to now as historical Palestine. It's not particularly historical, it was just under the British mandate, to partition it. The populations are not equal. That is, 2/3 of the population of Palestine are Palestinians, Palestinian
Right.
Arabs, and only a third are Jews. And the partition resolution gives a bit more than half of the land to the Jews, who are only a third of the population. So these numbers matter. The second thing that is important to understand is that on the 14th of May, 1948, when the state declares itself into being and issues this proclamation of a state, and as you say, says that within a few months, by October 1st that year, it would issue a constitution that would reflect or echo the Bill of Rights, that sort of lofty promises of equality for all that are in the proclamation of the state. At that time, the state is also involved in changing the demographic balance in Palestine. While that statement is being read, Palestinians are being kicked out of what becomes the state of Israel, which is much larger than what was given to it or what was allotted to it in the partition resolution. So not only does the state not issue a constitution that would actually ensure equal rights, although it certainly would, it also is actually engaged in making sure that the state that it is now creating and taking over more territory from what was given to it would have a Jewish majority in it. And the only way to accomplish that Jewish majority is through ethnic cleansing. There was another way, but that way was to bring millions of Jews from Europe. And that was foreclosed by the Nazis, who murdered most of the Jews of Eastern Europe, who were supposed to be, as Ben Gurion, the founder of the state, said, we won't have these battalions coming from Eastern Europe anymore because they've all been murdered. So the only other way to ensure a Jewish majority state, which was the goal of Zionism, was to get rid of the Palestinians. That's the cardinal moment. The state is born. It promises a constitution which it doesn't deliver. It makes sure that it would be a Jewish majority state through ethnic cleansing. And it never says what its borders are going to be. It does not say that the borders would be the partition resolutions borders, and in fact, its borders, the ceasefire line of 1949 is much bigger, but it doesn't say that that's the final border either. It's just a ceasefire line. And to this day, Israel does not have an officially recognized border. It is still a work in progress.
You know, when you describe this period, I flash onto sort of an early United States history where we have a declaration in 1776. It's like 14 years later, 89, where they come up with the Constitution, which in and of itself is not really a democratic constitution because it enshrines slavery. There's another 80 years and change before there's a second founding, really, with these 13th, 14th, and 15th. And then you're going to throw in an extra 100 years before they're actually honored in some form in the Americas. You know, maybe it's not an altogether, first of all, hopeless for Israel project, and maybe in its own way not so unique. I don't know. That's just what hit me, you know, as you describe those circumstances.
Yeah, look, first of all, the Constitution is not hopeless in the sense that, interestingly, in the last year or two, in part because of the current government's attempt to change the political system in Israel, the so-called judicial overhaul that began in around January 2023, when Netanyahu formed his current government, which has miraculously lasted for 4 years, despite the fiasco of October 7th. Since then, there have been voices in Israel, not only on the left, saying that Israel needs a constitution because it has been recognized that not having a constitution leaves the state highly vulnerable. In fact, I cite in the book a speech made in the Knesset by Menachem Begin. And Menachem Begin was the first right-wing prime minister in Israel, was the successor of Jabotinsky, who was the founder of revisionist right-wing Zionism, and was followed by Netanyahu. And Begin, in that speech, speaks in favor of having a constitution, says the state reneged on its promise to have a constitution. We need a constitution because the country does not really have, and he refers specifically to the US, does not have the same balance of power between the three main organs of the state. The executive is basically, as he says, the kind of the executive committee of the parliament, because the executive must have a majority in the parliament, so it's reflected in the parliament. That's the legislative, and the only thing that maintains somehow democracy for Jews in Israel is the Supreme Court. And the judicial coup of 2023, which is ongoing, was an attempt to weaken the Supreme Court. That is to make the executive all-powerful, which is making an authoritarian state. So people have realized that even in Israel, it's not, it may happen, possibly, but one has to recognize that that constitution, even if there were one, does not still address the issue of how can you create what the proclamation of the state promised, a Jewish and democratic state. How can you be both Jewish and democratic when so many of the people under your rule are not Jews? That's something that the state has never actually wanted to address. And as long as it doesn't address it, not only will it not be a true democracy, it'll also be engaged in more and more and more violence.
And as you describe in your book, you know, maybe until they rectify this with the zealots in control or marching back to Masada, at least, you know, a metaphorical Masada, it doesn't seem like this is at least for me, a sustainable endeavor. I get in a lot of conversations with people about this, and, you know, and I say, they might say, well, you're against Israel or you're anti-Semitic. I said, no, I'm really for Israel. I'm for a sustainable Israel so that Jewish kids, generation and generation, aren't corrupted, having to patrol Palestinian enclaves and streets and be hated and be brutalized by this colonial project. That is not sustainable to me. So I'm for Israel, but not this path that I see from afar. I've never been to Israel, but I'm connected to it in my own way.
Yeah, and if you went to Israel now, you could see very different things. You could go to Tel Aviv and sit on the beach and sip espressos, and it would feel kind of like, paradise. It's wonderful. And then you could drive 50 miles south, and you would be in a zone of utter destruction. And that would be Gaza. Of course, you would not be allowed in, and the international media has not been allowed in since the war began, and has, to its utter shame, not insisted on it, and not insisted to its governments to allow the media to report freely. Or you could go 30 miles to the east and come into an apartheid state where there are 3 million Palestinians living side by side with 700,000 settlers, Jewish settlers. The Palestinians have no rights at all. They're under military rule, arbitrary military rule. And the settlers are extraterritorial Israeli citizens. They don't live uh, officially in Israel, they live in an occupied territory, but they have all the rights of Israeli citizens. And of course, now they're also conducting daily pogroms against the Palestinians around them, extremely violent events, and they're trying to ethnically cleanse them. So, yes, if you were to go there, you could be sort of experiencing the ideal that some of your friends and will have of these beautiful suntanned, athletic Israeli Jews, or you could see them in their uniforms, now often masked, which is also something that Israel has something in common with what is happening in the United States,
Right, of
uh,
course.
n- not wanting to show their face because of social media and who knows, brutalizing Palestinians. And they haven't started doing that after October 7th. They've been doing that since 1967. So you have generations of young Israelis, many of them are now, of course, deep into retirement, uh, who are put into uniform, not to fight wars, not to protect the country from its enemies, but to enforce colonial rule over millions of Palestinians. And how do you do that? You do that by humiliating them, by breaking into their homes in the middle of the night, by stopping ambulances with pregnant women going to hospital and not allowing them through, by breaking children's toys and humiliating elderly people. That's how you do that. And what it does, it brutalizes and dehumanizes the population you're ruling over. And you can expect that it would respond in some way, often, as we saw on October 7th, in horrific ways. And it brutalizes you, and it makes you think of those people as anything but human. And that, of course, especially after October 7th, gives you a sense of utter license to simply wipe these people out, which is what Israel tried to do in Gaza.
And that would qualify as a genocidal project, as you describe in a couple of your op-eds, or I don't know if this is a less harsh term, but ethnic cleansing, a larger project to just remove and displace. I grew up watching Holocaust documentaries, by the ton in religious school and Spielberg, real movies. And, the mantra was never again, but maybe they just meant never again for us, because I think there's an obligation, not only for being Jewish, not only to the Jewish tribe, but to the larger human family. And it feels to me, just to look at it truthfully, that it's been, like you say, kind of ignored and compartmentalized sort of psychologically, in this box. I'm reminded of that movie. I wish I could remember the title, and it's a harsher analogy, but there was this happy family living right next to Auschwitz. Forget the name of it, but
Zone of interest.
Zone of interest, right. It was quite chilling. And there are various zones of interest as you describe it right now. Question for you, you try to dig into your biography a little bit. You are the son of founders, really, Zionist founders. You grew up in a kibbutz, as you describe it, and participated in, I think, what might largely be considered the last big existential war of 1973. How does all this make you feel? Because you're so vested in this national project, and then to see and write about what you're writing.
Yeah, look, I want to first respond to something you said, because I think it's important. You, like many Jews in the United States and in other countries and in Israel, grew up, like me, exposed to a vast amount of Holocaust imagery, and that is part of a generational thing. I mean, I don't know how old exactly you are, but we are, I think, sort of second generation to
Right.
the Holocaust. I certainly am. And what people don't understand often is that this immersion in Holocaust imagery obviously had a vast impact on whole generations of Jews everywhere, but the impact was different, and it depended what you do with this imagery, with this exposure, or overexposure, you might say. In the United States, by and large, certainly since the 1970s, 80s, increasingly with the creation of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, with, in LA, the Center for Tolerance, the idea was that you study the Holocaust so as to prevent that from happening everywhere to anyone, that it should teach you tolerance for all human beings. Now, of course, Jews had an investment in that because they're a minority and they would like to see a liberal society that is tolerant of minorities, which is natural. But the idea was to universalize the Holocaust, that the Holocaust is a lesson for the entire world, not to do that again. In Israel, once the Holocaust, and that took also until the 1980s, once the Holocaust kicked in as an event that was increasingly commemorated and taught in schools and became part of political rhetoric, all of it, of which really begins only in the 70s and 80s in particular, it was a very different lesson. The lesson was that we as a Jewish state should always carry a gun and should always know that we are under existential threat, and that if anyone tries to threaten us, that threat is as if they are about to carry out another Auschwitz against us. And when we feel that, when we are under existential threat, we don't give a hoot about what the rest of the world says. Yes, it's wonderful that there's international law and all these conventions, and we have signed some of them. We are, we're signatories to some of them. But if we are under threat, we always remember that the world stood by during the Holocaust, and we will do what it takes, and we won't listen to anyone. Anyone who rises against us, we will wipe them out. They will be like Amalek to us. That was very deeply ingrained. And as you say, the War of 73, the one that I fought in, was the last real war that Israel fought. That is a war against tanks, against airplanes, against real armies.
Right.
All the wars that Israel has fought since have been wars of choice by Israel against militants who could never pose an existential threat to it and who were largely its own creation. They were a response to its policies, to its refusal to compromise with its own neighbors, the people that it was ruling over, with its desire to have the land without the people. Uh, that is to ultimately ethnically cleanse those people. So, this is something that is actually really crucial, I think, to understand when we say what are the lessons of the Holocaust. Now, I dedicate my book to my father, as you saw, and I sort of half tongue in cheek, I say to my father, the last Zionist. Now, of course, there are millions of people in Israel who, if you ask them, would say, what is he talking about? I'm also a Zionist. What does he mean, the last Zionist? What I mean is that his kind of Zionism uh, was a very different kind of idea, different kind of ideology, different kind of worldview from what you see now. It had at its core a humanistic element, a socialist element, an idealistic element. It did believe in creating a just society. Now, one might say that, people like my father and many others were somewhat naive about that because they were also supporters of the Jewish nationalism, which was an ethno-national movement. But at least they had ideals about that. I was born in a kibbutz because my father dragged my mother to a kibbutz in 1951 because in 1951 he thought that the newly founded state of Israel, just founded, was already becoming corrupt, and that they should live in a more idealistic environment, live in a kibbutz where there was full equality. That's why I was born there. It was a choice by my father. And my mother actually did much more in that kibbutz than he ever did because he then wrote fiction and she taught school. But the idea was there. And his novels, certainly his early novels, he was a novelist, were about that, were about the striving for justice. He wrote a book about World War II because he was a soldier in the Jewish brigade of the British Army that he volunteered to when he was 17, about the encounter with the survivors. For him, that was what the state of Israel was. It would be a haven for people who had been persecuted and destroyed. The kind of Zionism that is being created now is a completely different animal. It is ultimately a Jewish supremacist ideology. It's a Jewish supremacist ideology that justifies oppression, violence, humiliation, ethnic cleansing, and after October 7th, genocide. And as such, as a political ideology, it has no right to exist anymore. Israel is a state that can and will and does exist, and it's not going anywhere. It's recognized internationally. All this, rhetoric about Israel has the right to exist. Of course, it has the right to exist. It does exist. It's
Right. It
recognized. It's a
exists. It's
member of the
there.
UN. Yeah, I mean, this
Exactly.
is nonsense, of course. But it does not have a right to be a genocidal state. That ideology that has now been tarred, branded for eternity with genocide has to be consigned to the garbage heap of history. Uh, in that sense, it's not a matter, when I say my father was the last Zionist, I mean that Zionism is dead and it cannot be revived. It's over. And what can it be? It has to reinvent itself as a decent society for all its citizens.
When I was a kid, you asked, I'm 70. I'm right now as old as I've ever been and as young as I'll ever be at the same time. But a couple memories I have was, young people, Jewish kids from the Reform Temple would go work on a kibbutz. I don't know. I don't hear that anymore. Now they might go to Israel and work in a IT company or something. It's a
Yeah.
totally different kind of paradigm. And I also have this memory, with people that would take issue a lot with what you're saying. When you talked about the possibility of peace with the Arabs back in the 70s, After all, Israel fought a war in 48, 56, 67, and 73 against truly existential enemies. And if you might suggest the possibility of peace, I have this thing in my head is like, you cannot make the peace with the animals. It's impossible. You cannot. It's the animals. You cannot make a peace with the animals. They will kill you. You cannot. They did.
Yeah.
The peace. They made a peace with Egypt, a truly existential enemy. And it's, for all its difficulties, the last time I checked, I even saw the Haaretz thing today. It's still in place. So the past in this Masada sort of mentality isn't necessarily prologue, in my view. There is perhaps a possibility for another alternative. And for the Palestinian people who think, does Israel have a right to exist? It doesn't. River to the sea, here's a heads up, it's there, nobody's going anywhere. And alternatively, for the hardline zealots, whatever, who want this Judea, Samaria, get rid of this, those people aren't really going anywhere either. So figure it fucking out. Like, it's not impossible in my view, even with everything that's so horrific that's happened.
So
that
war of 1973, which was a really bad war, and when October 7th happened, my first thought was October 6th, because October 6th, 1973, exactly 50 years before, I was a young soldier. We were preparing to go into some action in the afternoon, and one of the women in our unit came down the hill with a transistor radio in her hand and was shouting, it was 2:30 in the afternoon, was saying, "A war just began." And we said, "What?" We found out about the war from one of the women in our outfit who heard it on a transistor radio. The connection between these two events, 50 years apart, is the kind of arrogance that Israel had and the Israeli army was indulging in. All the information for an attack by the Egyptians and the Syrians was available. We know that. But the government had a conception, and the conception was, as Moshe Dayan, then Minister of Defense, said very clearly, better to have Sharm el-Sheikh, which is this spot in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, without peace, than to have peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. The Egyptian president in 1972 had proposed a peace with Israel. He said, you give us back the Sinai and we'll have peace with you. You took over our land, give it back to us and we'll have peace. And this was Israel's major enemy, right? It's the biggest, most powerful Arab country. Dayan said, why? We don't want to give it up. See what we did to them in the 6-Day War? Forget it. They can't do anything to us. Then they attacked. And then 3,000 Israeli soldiers were killed, 10,000 were wounded, tens of thousands of Egyptian and Syrian soldiers were killed. And then Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula, which it could have done before. That's what we saw also on October 7th. All the information was there. All the information that Hamas was about to attack was there. But Israel, the IDF, the Israeli politicians, Israeli media said, "What these Arabs, they call them barefooted people. That's how they speak about them. Apart from calling them human animals, of course. These people can attack us. They can't do anything. Forget it. These young women, young Israeli soldiers who were watching over and reporting to their commanders that Hamas was training for an attack were told, forget it. Stop complaining. We'll court-martial you if you continue." Half of them were killed on October 7th, these young female soldiers. who had been warning. And it was the same kind of arrogance that was the conception of Netanyahu for years before October 7th, that we don't need to deal with the occupation, we can manage it. We have enclosed Gaza behind a multi-billion-dollar fence. They can rot there. We don't care. Every once in a while, we'll mow the lawn. We'll provide them with millions of dollars because Netanyahu was filtering Qatari money in money bags handed over by Israelis to Hamas so that he could say that there's no one to talk with.
Right.
Because with Hamas, of course, you can't talk. And what people forget when they say that Israel is under existential threat today, Israel has peace, as you said, with Egypt and has had it for decades. It has peace with Jordan and has had it for decades. Saudi Arabia in 2002 offered a peace deal with Israel and with the rest of the Arab world, with the rest of the Sunni Arab world, which is the majority, on one condition, that Israel somehow find a solution for the occupation.
Right.
And Israel never even acknowledged that offer. The Gulf states have wanted peace with Israel now for at least a decade. So Israel actually has no Arab or Sunni Arab enemies. Iran is a different story. We can talk about that. The only problem that Israel has is that, as the Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said in 1967, after Israel occupied the territories, he said, "We want the bride, but not the dowry. We want the land, but not the people." The problem is, as you say, nobody's going away. The Palestinians, despite vehement efforts by Israel to kick them out, are there to stay. They call it sumut. They are holding on to the land. And the state of Israel is not going anywhere. No one is going to kick it to the sea. And so they have to find a way to live together. If they do, they will resolve the entire conflict in this whole region. The main reason for much of the violence, including, by the way, the utterly stupid war with Iran, is the issue between Israel and the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. That's the core issue. If you want to know why the U.S. went to war in Iran, which it had no business doing, it was because Netanyahu had this project with several American presidents, and finally he found one president who was ignorant enough and uncaring about facts enough that he said, "Okay, let's do it."
Right. Right. Just to take that left turn, people say, why did it happen? Now, I have no top secret clearance. I have no inside intel, but they didn't, or the U.S. and Netanyahu didn't attack Iran because they thought it was strong. They thought it because they attacked it because they believed it was weak and that it would be a once in a generation moment for the PVP, that's Putin's vice president, the billionaire brat boy, or a bully, whatever you want to call him, for him to have this heroic stature as the one who finally fulfilled the revenge clause for the hostage thing, in 80. It's my view, but I have no authority to make it other than that's what it looks like. It was like a bully move. As you describe these close opportunities, these near opportunities, or these olive branches, it all speaks to the core unresolved issue of these two, peoples. And we've seen reconciliation and other parts of the world, whether it was South Africa or a horrible civil war in the United States, followed by Jim Crow, but there are other narratives, and you've offered a narrative yourself, more along the lines of confederation. And I would like you to talk about that and see what's hopeful out there, because I don't even think they have to resolve the issue. If they can make considerable progress, there's a low-hanging fruit there for the Israeli future. And just for me, as I look across these continents and oceans at this place I've never been, Israel has such huge gifts for the world, whether it's science, technology, medicine, agriculture, water treatment, AI, and tourism. But it needs to be in the family of nations to offer these gifts. It can't be an exclusionary island on the world. So there's just all this. There is like hope, a hopeful world beyond this horizon, and you offered sort of your own maybe path towards that.
Yeah, look, so yes, I mean it's not just my vision. I'm actually, using the vision of a particular movement that I've become part of. I was initially quite skeptical about and have become persuaded that what they're offering for the future is probably the best that there is out there. But I should say Israel now really has, two futures, two scenarios. One scenario is very dark. And part of that dark scenario will also be that it will become even more than it is now an international pariah.
Right.
It is well on the way to becoming that. And as an international pariah, it will be a pretty miserable place to live in, and eventually won't be able to even defend itself. Never mind about external enemies, but because of the huge turmoil within Israeli society itself. And many of the people that you mentioned, those who, create all these AI things, all the water treatment plants, all the interceptor missiles, all of that, the doctors, the scientists, they will leave. They're actually, many of them are right now have suitcases under their beds. They're waiting to see what the result of the election will be. And if Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich and these absolutely horrible people are re-elected, they will leave in large numbers. So that sort of promise of Israel will be just that, just a promise. Um, and it will become an apartheid state, a full-blown apartheid state, an authoritarian state, in many ways, ironically, a halachic state, which already, that is a state ruled by Jewish religion. So it'll become increasingly similar to Iran, which is so, and to the vision that Hamas has for the kind of Palestine that they want, ruled by old religious men who will tell other people, not least women, how to behave or how not to behave in particular. So that's one future. The other future is less likely, but I can sketch it out. And I have to say, before I sketch it out, that the only way to get to it will not be through something that is generated only from within. Because within Israeli society today, even if Netanyahu, God willing, inshallah, as the Arabs would say, is gone at the end of October, and there's a new government, the opposition has no plans. These people who want to form a coalition have no plans for Palestinians, not at all. Recently, one of them, Eisenkot, who is the likely replacement for Netanyahu, said, "Oh no, there will never be a Palestinian state. Forget it. It's not going to happen." So for that, they have no plan whatsoever. So in order to actually activate the kind of plan that I can describe in a minute, there would need to be massive pressure on Israel. It won't come from within. Israelis are completely brainwashed now into thinking that Palestinians just want to destroy them, that they're not human beings, and that if they stay, if we can't kick them out, they have to stay well under our boot. So there has to be pressure. That pressure is not just words. There has to be a sanctions regime against Israel. There has to be the kind of regime that was a legal, international legal regime, similar to what happened with South Africa. There has to be economic, political, and military sanctions on Israel. If that doesn't happen, that Israel will be helped by its supporters into the abyss. Those people who say, no, 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 it's a wonderful state, let's not put pressure on it, it will slide directly into the abyss of a authoritarian, religious, violent pariah state. So what is the alternative? The alternative, and it's a blueprint, and I think it's important to have that blueprint because things change. We don't know when and under what circumstances, but they may change, and it's good to have an alternative plan. That alternative plan, and people can Google it under A Land for All, is really a confederation plan which acknowledges that the old idea of a two-state solution is derelict. It's gone. It can't happen. If you look at the map of the West Bank, you will see why, because it's like Swiss cheese. There's no way to create two separate states that have a big war between them.
Right.
It's just not possible. So at the same time, both groups want the same thing. Both Palestinians and Jews want first a right of self-determination and secondly a right of return. And you have to acknowledge the fact that Israel has it and the Palestinians do not. So how do you square the circle? Well, the idea is to create two states that would be more or less along the 1967 border, but that would make a distinction between citizenship and residence. So you could be a citizen of one state. Let's say you live in LA, you trace your family back to Haifa, and your grandfather was kicked out of Haifa by the Zionists, ended up in Beirut, somehow made his way to LA, and you are third generation, but you grew up as a Palestinian and you have a strong Palestinian identity. Now there is a state of Palestine. You could go there and become a Palestinian citizen if they had the same kind of law of return as Israel does. Just like you,
Okay.
if you wanted to, could become an Israeli citizen. Once you become a Palestinian citizen, you could apply for residence in Haifa. And you could live, if you were allowed to, you could live in Haifa as a Palestinian citizen. You would vote for the Palestinian parliament. You may vote in local elections because you live in a neighborhood, but the national elections, you would vote for a Palestinian parliament. Similarly, if you are a settler living near Nablus or Hebron, and you decide that you want to stay in the state of Palestine, and I assume many settlers would not, but you say, I will stay here. You could. You would be allowed to. You would be an Israeli citizen. You would be voting for the Israeli parliament. You would be a resident of Palestine. And as long as you obeyed its laws and didn't go out every morning and uproot a few olive trees, which is what many of these guys are doing now, you could live there. If you behaved badly, you would be deported to the state of your citizenship, and you would not be allowed to live there. Now, obviously, this wouldn't work if millions of Palestinians wanted to come to Israel or millions of Jews wanted to move to Palestine. The model is the model of the EU. You could be French and live in Berlin, and there's no problem with that. You would get a residence permit. But if 5 million French people wanted to move to Germany, that would be a political crisis. So it would have to be managed. But the point is that the borders between the two states would be open, and there would be a recognition that both groups have a strong emotional, traditional, religious connection to the whole land, but that they live only in part of it, and they can move from one part to another. As far as Jerusalem is concerned, it would become a city where there would be the capital of Palestine and the capital of Israel, and it would also be recognized as a city with an international standing. What is curious about this plan, and I don't know that the people who thought about it at the beginning even knew that, the partition resolution of the UN from 1947, which created these two states, of which only one actually then came into being, talked about exactly the same thing. They actually were talking about a confederation, which would recognize that there are people living on both sides of these borders they were planning for the two states. And because the country is now completely inextricably woven, whether it's water or power or internet, everything is, you cannot cut it, you can't tear it apart.
Right.
That tries to recognize both what people want and hope for and the realities on the ground that make the old two-state solution no longer possible.
And I've done a lot of reading about with Thomas Friedman. He talks about how these economies are already and have been deeply intertwined. Workers commuting from and serving in all sectors of the Israeli economy, paying taxes. So there's not just a hateful adversarial narrative, there's other narratives going on too. And as you describe this this path towards some kind of reconciliation, the feeling I get is like, oh my God, what a relief. What an example to the rest of the world. What a triumph over this kind of tribal, unending violence that feels like it's, medieval or just going back to, the ancient times. So as you describe it, I feel emotional as if this would be this, incredible relief. And then I could feel great about going to Israel.
Yeah, me too. I've been not going there since December of 2024 because I just also been saying things that might get me into trouble with the current authorities there. Um, I'm hoping after the elections to be able to go. But look, I want to say that in order for anything like this to happen, you need, as I said, first of all, major pressure on Israel, because you need to bring Israel back to its um, normal proportions. The limits of Israeli power have been defined in recent decades in Washington, D.C. And that means that there are no limits to Israeli power. That has to stop. Not only because American taxpayers are paying for a lot of bombs that are destroying a lot of lives, but also because for the good of Israel, it has to be brought back to its natural dimensions to recognize that it's leading itself into a hole that it won't be able to come out of. The second thing that is really necessary, and countries that have come out of periods of war and violence and genocide have had to recognize that, is a kind of truth and reconciliation. You can't do it without that. You cannot forget what happened in 1948. You can't wipe it off people's memory, and you can't forget what happened in Gaza. That has to be faced up to. Um, and for that to happen, Israel has to recognize wrongs that it did. Those can't be repaired. You can't bring back the lives that were lost and tens of thousands of them. But you have to recognize wrongs and you have to do something to show that you're willing to repair that you're willing to have some process of restitution. That will change the atmosphere entirely. Most people, I do believe, most Palestinians and most Israelis, and as you say, they're wonderful people in Israel Palestine. I know amazing Palestinians. I know quite a number of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they're amazing Jewish Israelis. creative and very special and thoughtful and kind. Um, and they exist, and you can work with them, but you have to provide them with the space to emerge. Right now, they can't emerge. They're under this sort of pressure of fanatic, racist leaders, certainly in Israel, which is the power broker. There is no symmetry there here. I mean, Israel has all the power, but also among Palestinians, certainly Hamas. You have to create that. And that has to be created through recognizing these wrongs and then promising people a better future and having a leadership, both local and international, that would persuade people that it's serious about it, that it will help them go in that direction. So, yes, I think it's possible, but not only through kind words, but also through pretty severe actions.
Well, I think what you're doing is part of that process because, embedded in this is recognition of the truth of our history. And I'm reminded of on the time I was in Berlin and walking the streets and seeing those little squares. They're like brass about, this big. And this family was here. And on this date, they were taken. And on this date, they died in Auschwitz. And it's just fact. It's incontrovertible. And, Germany had to endure a catastrophe of the highest order and some decades before they could come to recognition of the truth of their history. We have big issues in the United States about the truth of our history, whether it's slavery or Jim Crow or many other things. But you're part of that project of the truth of our history. And I think without that, some of the things you're talking about are more difficult. So I appreciate what you're up to. I really
Thank
do.
you.
It's important work, and sometimes the thinkers have to be, in my view, at the point of this spear, because it doesn't have to be hopeless, and truth, reconciliation, and reparations of some sort are critical. And just to my friends that think I'm a schmuck and like, what are you talking about? It's hopeless, these people. I always say I'm for Israel, but I'm for sustainable Israel that can go forward. And I just have this thought. It always hits me in the head. Does every people deserve its own state? I don't know if you can get it, but every people deserves equal rights within the state that they live in. That's sort of like, I don't know, my final thought on that, I guess.
Yeah.
So I
Look, I
just
mean,
want, go ahead.
I'll just say, I lived in Berlin in 1987,
Okay.
and there was a great big wall in the middle of the city, and no one thought that that wall would ever go away. It was a natural phenomenon. It was just there
Right.
to stay.
Yes.
And now you go to Berlin, nobody knows where the wall was. It's gone. You need
Right.
little signs to tell you the wall was here. So yes, but this can change, and I think I don't know exactly who your listeners are, but if they are American Jews, then American Jews can make a huge difference in this. They really can, but they have to put pressure on their own government, on their own representatives, to force Israel to do the right thing for itself. And as long as they don't, as long as they're in a defensive mode, they're going to, first of all, harm Israel, and by that harm themselves, because what Israel is doing is indeed harming Jews around the world.
Yes.
One has to understand that. It's making Jews less safe around the world. And that has to change. And American Jewry can actually make a difference.
And, just as a sidebar, the San Fernando Valley, near a few minutes from where I live, is filled with Israelis that don't want to be in Israel anymore for a multitude of reasons. But I think a big one is, what we've been talking about. Omer Bartov, thank you for your incredible insight, your scholarship, and your courage and your life story, which I think just gives you a unique authority to talk about these things. And folks, check out the book, What Went Wrong. Implicit in what went wrong are some things that also went right. And they're there to be discovered. And it was an eye-opening and a great read for me. And it's worth your time. Folks, till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namaste aloha. Till next time, see ya.